last week or two, Morbius has suddenly taken the world by storm, which has naturally led to its nickname, the Morbius Sweep. Why? It's because Morbius has officially arrived on digital storefronts and has magically become the #1 movie bought on Apple TV. No, really, the Morbius Twitter account tweeted about that accomplishment. I don't know if it's out of sheer boredom or because the internet just wanted to bring this gigantic meme into existence for the sake of their entertainment or as an overly big joke, but apparently it's Morbin time. It's Morbin time here, there, and everywhere. At this point, we are Morbius. Wait, no, that's not how the line went.
We are Venom.
And since there's been so much of this Morbin talk surrounding Morbius, I decided to finally watch Morbius with the intention of one single goal: to answer the one question most people probably have. Is Morbius unironically good? After finally watching Morbius, I can shockingly say I don't strongly hate it. I feel like people might have overly hated Morbius when it came out. Don't get me wrong, Morbius is a bad superhero movie. It's not a mind-blowing movie that'll make you think this is cinema, as comic book or superhero Twitter likes to throw around as a meme. In the weirdest way possible, Morbius feels like a movie that was originally made in the early to late 2000s and is now being released. Like, as you watch Morbius, you can't help but think to yourself, we've progressed so far from this type of movie formula for superhero movies. However, at the same time, it oddly fits this movie's story or vibe somehow. The best way I can put it is that Morbius, for me, is more of a mixed bag rather than being the world's worst superhero movie, which is what the initial reviews portrayed Morbius to be. The core reason I say this is because I've severely lowered any expectations I have for any upcoming Sony Spider-Man universe projects after my experience with Venom Let There Be Carnage. As for Morbius, it doesn't try to do too much, it doesn't stray too far from the story or its subplots. The main issues I have with Morbius have more to do with the problems surrounding its plot than anything else. Even with that being the case, I still found one or two things that I genuinely didn't expect to like at all. In fact, I did walk away from Morbius kind of shocked to have any positive thing to say about it, considering how many people across YouTube or Twitter have ripped this movie to shreds. The biggest strength or positive in Morbius is how this movie shockingly gives Michael Morbius way more depth than I thought he'd have as a protagonist. At least this is in comparison to Eddie Brock in Venom and Venom Let There Be Carnage. That's not to say that Morbius is inherently better than both of those movies, but I will argue that it's at least better than Venom Let There Be Carnage. Michael Morbius is a complicated protagonist. His moral compass is the rare gray moral compass that we don't typically see in a protagonist when it comes to superhero movies. Morbius himself states that he is willing to make an unorthodox decision if need be for the sake of saving a life. And what I love the most about this is that the movie doesn't forcefully try to get you to like Morbius as it does with Eddie Brock and Venom's chemistry. The movie just tells its story, and while it does that, it shows the good, bad, and flawed aspects of Michael Morbius. He clearly cares about Dr. Bancroft, the love interest of this movie for those of you that haven't seen it, and he also clearly cares about his best friend Milo, whose name is actually Lucian. Real quick sidebar, I don't understand why this movie went out of its way to name Lucian Milo. Like, even a grown adult who's the caretaker for Lucian and Morbius calls Lucian Milo, and it's like, why? Just call him Lucian. Just because Morbius at a young age called every other kid he met before Lucian Milo doesn't make Morbius right, nor should their caretaker enable that behavior. The fact that this was a thing 25 years later, where Lucian is still willingly going by the name Milo, is incredibly ridiculous, but I digress. Anyway, those positive moments between Morbius and those supporting characters actually feel earned, at least in the sense that you can logically get behind those moments without really complaining too much about it. However, when you think that this movie is going to continue going down the positive route for Morbius, it keeps things interesting by using Morbius's core trait, which is being a gifted genius, against him for the sake of his growth. For instance, despite being a gifted genius, Morbius only does a total of like 2 to 3 trials to test his theory about splicing bat DNA into human DNA, and maybe I'm overthinking it, but you'd think you need more than 2 trials before doing a human trial, but hey, what do I know? I'm not the gifted genius here. On top of that, he's also willing to go into international waters for the sake of being legal to do this procedure, which of course goes wrong and leads to him unconsciously killing people. There's also the fact that he trapped a bunch of bats to do tests on them without people technically knowing at the beginning of the movie, but who's judging, you know? The point is that Morbius isn't this go-getter or this overly friendly, positive, likable guy. He's a person that's willing to blur the lines a little to get what he wants, and is willing to go the extra step that most heroes or protagonists might not be willing to take due to their heroic moral compass. And as much as I hate to admit it, it's kind of a little refreshing in a way. We don't typically get that from this type of protagonist in a superhero movie. And honestly, that isn't the only part I somewhat enjoyed in regards to Michael Morbius as a protagonist. Not only because they shed Michael Morbius in both a positive and negative light, but they kind of give him vulnerable moments as well. As the movie progresses, some moments are designed to give the viewer that pause like, damn, that does suck to see him go through this. Or damn, it sucks to see how this vampire side of him is affecting his life. You know, assuming the viewer watched the movie without any real preconceived notions. For example, the way Morbius explains the ongoing internal battle, which is something wakes up inside me, something primal, and it wants to hunt and it wants to kill, legitimately made me think, damn, that's rough. It's also fairly easy to buy into one of this movie's very few core moments where Morbius is trying to plead with Milo to not do his human trial because it isn't worth it since vampirism feels like a legitimate curse. Morbius isn't happy about where he's at, and it's clear that he kind of regrets it despite him getting the health of an Olympic athlete, which he states himself, I'm not just making that description up, I promise. For a large portion of this movie, he has that internal struggle that heavily affects his life far more than his illness previously did. I'd argue it hurts him worse than Eddie Brock was hurt in the first Venom movie, even though he almost died trying to achieve symbiosis with Venom. It hurts more in Morbius because its protagonist was only trying to find a legitimate cure for him and his best friend. It hurts more because Morbius's decision to do a human trial on himself backfired, since he technically had good intentions even though he should have gone about it better. And more importantly, it hurts more in this movie because Michael Morbius has actual depth in comparison to Eddie Brock, whose entire personality is in a constant state of confusion. And yes, if you can't tell by now, I have a problem with the Venom movies. So what? The other thing I liked in Morbius, which I'm shocked to say this, is some of the action scenes. Weirdly, Morbius's action scenes feel so heavily reminiscent of early 2000s superhero movies. Like, I couldn't help but find myself feeling like we've seen all of Morbius's superhero action moments before. And for most people, that would be a massive negative, understandably so. But for some reason, I kind of dug it because of its nostalgic feel. I know, it's weird. I genuinely don't know how to explain this feeling, but I hope people can understand what I mean by this. Anyway, this movie loved throwing in slow motion scenes when Morbius used his vampire abilities, such as when he was first learning how to use echolocation, even if the moment didn't need slow motion. Honestly, I wanted to laugh at the fact that they kept doing this, but I kind of respect that they were so confident with their use of slow motion, as if this this movie didn't have too much of it. Along with that, I actually kind of appreciated that they made Morbius have some sort of colored smoke when he's running on buildings, flying through the cities, or more importantly, fighting Milo, who is the antagonist of this movie. Why do I appreciate it? It's because it made watching those scenes so much more bearable, and it was unironically easier to track two ridiculously fast vampires as they fought each other. Plus, it also kind of felt like they learned from the first Venom movie, which was heavily criticized for the final fight scene, which was pretty much impossible to read or track because it was two similarly colored symbiotes fighting each other. The only thing I wish we got out of those fast running moments that led to this visually appealing smoke was an explanation as to why it changed colors. One moment it was red, the next minute it's purple, and it's like, I can understand if people try to come up with a reasoning such as, oh well, he drank blood this time, or he drank this weird thing that one time, but I would have liked it if the movie definitively told us why the color change was happening. Clear, concise reasoning that backtracked to something specific in this movie, be it a moment or thing that tied itself to his character or personality, would have made it far more significant and interesting. Finally, this brings me to Morbius and all of its flaws. As I just mentioned, I do love some of the nostalgic charms that Morbius has, since it does heavily feel like the most generic early 2000s superhero movie we've all probably seen before one way or another. However, that nostalgic charm that I was talking about also heavily bites the movie in the ass. Morbius is arguably the most predictable superhero movie I've seen in a very long time. Within probably 10 if not 15 minutes, I knew exactly what was going to happen. Morbius is gonna do something stupid that leads to him becoming a vampire. The girl they're introducing is the love interest, which means something bad will likely happen to her. And the best friend they're introducing at the very beginning of the movie is likely gonna be the antagonist who flips on Morbius. You're able to get that plot so quickly that I wouldn't blame anyone if they tapped out because of how predictable this movie is. It also doesn't help that Morbius almost feels insulting at times because it just doesn't try to engage with your mind or throw in cool plot twists that you weren't legitimately expecting to get you excited or hyped. The experience of watching Morbius is primarily, oh, that's a cool idea, and then like 20 minutes of dialogue happens to get you from one point to another, and then another, oh, that's another cool idea, but it could have been done better, and that cycle just repeats for an hour and 40 minutes. It's not fun, it's just boring and somewhat disappointing. Things just feel like they happen in this movie without any attempt to make you fully emotionally invested in the overall story or to make you care about other characters not named Michael Morbius, who only has a handful of vulnerable moments that may or may not make you care about Morbius. The worst way to put it is that Morbius has very much been there, done that, in the sense of superhero movies having grown past this years ago. The idea of a superhero movie having two characters with identical powers that will fight each other by the end of the movie as its core premise is a hard sell in this day and age. We've grown so past this in the superhero genre that it's simply not good enough anymore. It only worked in the first Venom movie because of one reason and one reason only: Venom's personality. Whether I personally like Venom's jokes or lighthearted personality is not important. What is important is the fact that the masses loved Venom's personality. That is what makes people tune into Venom movies. That's what gets people excited for more Venom movies. And most importantly, that's what carries the entirety of the ongoing Venom franchise on its back. In the case of Morbius, it doesn't have that. Michael Morbius, who is a somewhat interesting protagonist, as I've said earlier in this video, doesn't appeal to the mass audiences. He's far more serious and only really cracks one joke in this movie, which is the I am Venom joke. That's it. It's hard for Morbius to succeed as it attempts to do the same thing that previous Sony Spider-Man universe movies did without the one thing that made those movies work for the mass audiences: a lovable protagonist. Not only that, Morbius makes one of the most ridiculous mistakes one could make in superhero movies. No one, and I mean no one, likes it when movies have one character say this overly difficult scientific explanation only for it to be immediately explained in simpler terms by another character. That hasn't been funny for I don't know how long. It's only funny when it leads to a pun or a joke by a supporting character in a franchise like the Fast and Furious, because of course no one takes that franchise seriously. That's the point of that type of franchise. They know we're here for the action and stupid family moments, not some typical nerdy character who's explaining incredibly detailed terms to a cast of characters who will not understand a single word they're saying. That's why those moments are written to lead to a funny moment to get the audience to laugh. In Morbius, it's done several times and it just feels like it's done for the sake of, well, Morbius is a genius, so he can obviously never say something simple. That would ruin his character. Let's just make another supporting character explain it to the audience, so that way Morbius can still come off as a genius and we can make the audience not feel dumb for not understanding something that is designed for them to not understand. At that point, why do that? Why create that extra step? It's not worth it. It's not worth creating self-made hurdles like that ridiculous choice that we pivoted from doing years ago, when this movie couldn't even overcome the one hurdle it needed to primarily focus on overcoming, proving to the audience that a movie starring Morbius without Spider-Man was worth making. And truthfully, I'd probably feel differently if Morbius had a much stronger antagonist, which is another flaw of this movie. Milo, Lucian, whatever you like to call him at this point, isn't a good antagonist at all. Milo doesn't even become an antagonist until the last quarter of the movie, as time passes while you're sitting there watching this movie. Like, there's gonna be an antagonist at some point, right? Because this movie takes forever to get to the point where it realizes, oh yeah, there needs to be a villain. This is a superhero movie after all. And by the time Milo is finally revealed to be the antagonist of this movie, which, as I said, is telegraphed from quite literally the opening section of this movie, it's not worth the payoff. You're not surprisingly shocked, nor do you sympathize with his reasons for becoming a villain, because the reasoning makes your eyes roll. Milo's sole reason for being a villain is due to childish jealousy. He is jealous that Morbius is suffering from vampirism, but is technically healed from his previous sickness. He doesn't care or listen to Morbius when Morbius pleads to him to not take the serum from his human trial because it's not worth the trade-off. If anything, that pleading just makes him madder and more jealous, so he takes the serum out of spite. Mind you, this is done off screen and isn't shown at all. This movie just shows us a vampire eating some random unimportant character in a hallway after the pleading scene between Morbius and Milo, which is initially blamed on Morbius, but the movie tries to be like, aha, gotcha, see, it was Milo, not Morbius. And it's like, dude, yeah, we know it was Milo. We've known that Milo was eventually going to be the villain the minute you introduced him at the beginning of the movie. We've kind of been waiting for that subplot to make an appearance. Plus, you could have at least had the decency to visually show Milo taking the serum so we could see how he reacts to the serum initially. Or how about showing Milo testing out his powers and discovering his abilities, considering Morbius testing out his powers is one of the most interesting moments in this movie. Don't make Milo suddenly appear and be like, see Morbius, I'm a vampire now. I can do everything you could do and more because I embrace being a vampire unlike you. That is so incredibly corny and lackluster that it just leaves me puzzled as to why they thought that approach was better than showing us Milo's rise as a threat. It didn't work at all, and it just feels like the same repeated mistake they made in the first Venom movie with the lack of showcasing Riot and Carlton Drake achieving symbiosis. The moments where villains are beginning to become a threat to our main protagonist are kind of pivotal because it's an integral part of the story. I know, making the viewer care about the antagonist of a superhero movie, or at least be concerned about the potential threat an antagonist poses to our protagonist, is a crazy concept. The funniest part is that this flaw would have never happened had this movie not wasted anybody's time spontaneously cutting away to the world's most useless set of B-tier characters I've probably ever seen in a superhero movie. For some odd reason, Morbius has these two cops. For reference, one is played by Tyrese Gibson, and they do nothing. They serve almost zero purposes beyond getting Morbius into the position of realizing that Milo took his serum. You could cut those characters out of this movie and replace all of their screen time with moments for Milo's character growth so he becomes a character we're semi-concerned about, and it do this movie far more justice. It is ridiculous that Morbius wastes our time with these characters because we don't care about them. This movie does nothing to make us want to see these characters at all. This movie doesn't even really give those cops a purpose beyond attempting to be comedic relief, although they're not funny at all. In fact, I also question the logic behind these characters. For example, there's a moment where Morbius flies all the way to the top of a very tall building. I'm talking about multiple flights of stairs, by the way. You'd probably have to be the Flash to catch up to Morbius. That's how quick he flies up this building. And yet, Morbius gets to the top and suddenly, out of nowhere with no questions asked, one of the regular human, non-vampire infected cops appears behind Morbius and arrests him. How does that make any sense? How could that have possibly happened? There's absolutely no way in hell that could have happened. No one, and I mean no one, could convince me that they ran up those flights of stairs that quickly, nor could you convince me that an elevator could be used that quickly either. It makes quite literally no sense even for a superhero movie. And yes, I'm fully aware that me venting about this comes off as me being nitpicky and focusing on the flaw that truly isn't that serious. So you know what? I'm going to get nitpicky and discuss a flaw that legitimately matters and deserves to truly be criticized. The visual effects for Morbius's and Milo's faces are downright terrible. It's almost painful to look at their faces, and it's not even because of a narrative reason where a character is purposely designed to have a grim look due to a legitimate reason that comes from their backstory. It's because their faces are just so terribly designed that it makes me question, why didn't they do something more practical or at least created a better design in general? This movie wants you to look at Morbius so badly, and yet every single time we get a shot of the vampire version of Morbius, I want it to cut away to something else. I don't know if it's the weird choice of making him have a beard when he turns into a vampire, or his vampire nose, or the weird change in his skin when he turns into a vampire, but something is just so incredibly off-putting about his face. And when it comes to the visual effects of Milo's face, it just looks like there was no budget left for his face at all. Whether it's a shot of his face in the darkness or a shot of him as a vampire in bright light, Milo somehow never looks good as a vampire. It's pathetic, to be honest. It's pathetic that this is what we've gotten in the modern age of superhero movies, and sure, it could be due to the pandemic, which I don't entirely dismiss, but it's not like Venom Let There Be Carnage looked this terrible visually, if I'm being honest. It just feels like they couldn't figure out how to create better designs for the faces of these vampire characters that we're being forced to look at for the entirety of this movie. I really can't emphasize this enough. It is genuinely sad that the main protagonist and antagonist of a modern superhero movie both look awful in nearly every scene they're in when they use their powers. And outside of this movie possibly being affected by the pandemic, I really don't know if there's any other excuse for this problem. In all honesty, it almost feels inexcusable considering the visual effects for their faces are on par with old superhero movies like Fantastic Four. This flaw, along with my other frustrations with Morbius, ties back to the number one realization I had after watching Morbius. Sony Pictures still has yet to figure out how to make a legitimately good superhero movie. That's the hard truth. Sony Pictures hasn't figured out how to create a better formula that works for this entirely unnecessary cinematic universe. The core problem of Sony's Spider-Man universe is the lack of Spider-Man. For these movies to work, assuming they actually plan on making more standalone anti-hero movies and sequels for Venom or Morbius, these anti-heroes need a better antagonist. Having these copycat antagonists who are identical to the superheroes or anti-heroes or whatever you want to call them in superhero movies is not cutting it anymore. The idea of Morbius having a sequel where Bancroft is the villain as teased in the ending of this movie is such a terrible move, just like it's a terrible move for the third Venom movie once again to have another different color symbiote as another antagonist. These movies would benefit so much more from having Spider-Man continuously being the antagonist, because at least when they do that, we as fans know Spider-Man isn't a bad guy, but we're at least seeing Spider-Man as the villain from an actual villain or anti-hero's perspective. It'd be a refreshing take on Spider-Man and be different enough from what we know thanks to Spider-Man in the MCU and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and its respective sequels. And I don't know if the answer is necessarily bringing one of the old Spider-Man or Tom Holland Spider-Man into these movies, if I'm being honest. For one, I do think it kind of ruined the fanfare and rebirth that Andrew and Tobey got from Spider-Man No Way Home, which was essentially perfect. And two, I just don't think Sony Pictures and Marvel should rely on Tom Holland to continuously be Spider-Man going forward. If it was up to me, I'd say bring in an entirely new iteration of Spider-Man, do something new for once, bring in a new Spider-Man that we can get to know over time and actually become familiar with. That way there's less conflict of, oh, but Tom has to do this Sony Pictures movie, which means the MCU movies being delayed, or, oh well, Sony Pictures is ruining Tom's character growth in the MCU, and things of that nature. Creating a new iteration of Spider-Man specifically designed to be a repeated antagonist for the Sony Spider-Man universe movies could give Sony Pictures so much more freedom. We're 3 movies into Sony's Spider-Man universe, and somehow this universe has peaked at its first movie. Venom is still the best Sony Spider-Man universe movie, and that, at its best, is a mediocre popcorn flick. Venom Let There Be Carnage, on the other hand, fails to be anywhere close to the quality of its predecessor and should have been so much better considering Venom was a shocking hit among the mass audience. That now leaves us with Morbius, and the question I set out to find the answer to: is Morbius unironically good? The answer to that question is absolutely not. No, not at all. Are you kidding me? Morbius is a bad superhero movie. My problem with Morbius is that there are compelling ideas that work for me, such as Michael Morbius as the protagonist, considering he's interesting in my opinion, and some of the action scenes have a bit of a nostalgic charm to them. However, Morbius fails on pretty much every other front. There are repeated mistakes that you'd expect to be reminded of after watching an old superhero movie from the early 2000s. There are terrible visual effects that look incredibly dated. Morbius doesn't even really have an antagonist until the last act of the movie, and I say that despite the antagonist being telegraphed a mile away. And most importantly, Morbius, once again, has an identical copycat villain who isn't fun to watch, because not only are there poorly written intentions, but it's not fun to watch identical copycat villains in this day and age of superhero movies. I just want to emphasize that I don't think Morbius is a god-awful, terrible movie. I really don't. It's just that its mistakes feel incredibly insulting because you think that Sony Pictures would have learned by now. Instead, Morbius continues the downhill trend when it comes to Sony's Spider-Man universe, leaving little to no hope for the not-too-distant future for this cinematic universe. Unfortunately, Morbius feels a lot like a movie you've already seen before. Between its repeated mistakes that we've seen in the prior Venom movies to perpetually feeling like a movie that's stuck in the early 2000s, Morbius isn't unironically good. There's nothing to really excite you in this movie because this movie doesn't really engage with the viewer as it should. There's nothing to make you excited for its likely sequel because it'll likely have another identical antagonist, and there's nothing that'll make you want to rewatch this movie in the long run. Unlike Venom, Morbius is not only not enjoyable or not rewatchable, but it doesn't really leave anything to be desired as well. It's just Morbius, and honestly, that's probably the best way to put it. It is unfortunately no longer Morbin time.